3, the firefighter's prayer. Captain Miguel Santos had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. In his 18 years with the fire department, he had pulled bodies from burning buildings, held grieving families in his arms, and carried the weight of those he could not save. But nothing had prepared him for the Riverside Elementary fire. It was a Tuesday morning when the alarm pierced the quiet of Station 19. A gas leak explosion had engulfed half of the school in flames, with over 300 children and staff trapped inside. As Miguel's crew raced through the streets, sirens wailing, he did something he had not done in years, praying. "God," he whispered as they approached the towering inferno, "if you're listening, we're going to need your help today." Miguel had grown up Catholic, but his faith had been evaluated by years of seeing senseless tragedies. How could a loving God allow children to suffer? How could divine mercy exist in a world where flames showed no mercy? These questions had haunted him, creating a chasm between the man he was and the faith his grandmother had instilled in him. But as he suited up outside the burning school, watching teachers frantically counting children on the playground while others remained trapped inside, Miguel felt something shift in his chest. It was not panic or fear, emotions he had learned to compartmentalize. It was something deeper, quieter, but infinitely more powerful. The first rescue was a kindergarten class trapped on the second floor. As Miguel climbed the ladder truck, smoke billowing around him, he recited the Lord's Prayer, words he had not spoken since his grandmother's funeral. With each word, his breathing steadied, his focus sharpened. "Thy will be done," he murmured as he broke through a classroom window. Inside, he found 26 five-year-olds huddling with their teacher in the far corner. The smoke was thick, the heat overwhelming, but Miguel moved with a calm precision that surprised even him. One by one, he passed the children to his partner on the ladder. The teacher, Mrs. Chen, was barely conscious of smoke inhalation. "I've got you," Miguel told her as he lifted her into his arms. "You're safe now." As he carried her to safety, Mrs. Chen whispered, "The children, are they all?" "Every single one," Miguel assured her. "You kept them calm, kept them together. You saved their lives." But the hardest test was yet to come. The building's structure was failing, and intelligence reports showed that Mr. Davis, the school janitor, was still trapped in the basement where the explosion had originated. The chief was ready to call off the search. The building could collapse at any moment. Miguel looked at the flaming structure, then at his crew. These people would follow him anywhere, but he could not ask them to risk their lives on what might be a futile mission. "I'm going in alone," he announced. "Like hell you are," replied his partner, Jake, a 20-year veteran. "We don't leave anyone behind." As they descended into the smoke-filled basement, the heat was so intense it felt like walking into an oven. Miguel's breathing apparatus showed only minutes of air staying. The ceiling creaked ominously above them. That was when Miguel prayed aloud, not just for himself, but for his team, for Mr. Davis, for the strength to do what needed to be done. "Give us the courage to face what we cannot change," he prayed, "and the strength to save what we can." They found Mr. Davis unconscious beneath a collapsed beam, his legs pinned. As Miguel and Jake worked to free him, the building shuddered. Debris rained down around them. "Captain," Jake's voice was urgent through the radio, "we've got maybe 30 seconds before this whole section comes down." Miguel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility, the fear of failure, the possibility of leaving his own family without a father. In that moment of ultimate uncertainty, he felt something he had not experienced in years: his peace. Not the absence of fear, but something greater than fear. With a strength that seemed to come from beyond his own reserves, Miguel lifted the beam just enough for Jake to pull Mr. Davis free. They carried him toward the exit as the building groaned and twisted around them. Miguel's air alarm was screaming, his tank was empty. The ceiling collapsed just as they reached the basement stairs. Miguel shoved Jake and Mr. Davis ahead of him, then felt the world explode in heat and darkness. He woke up 3 days later in the hospital. His family surrounded his bed. His wife Maria was crying, their daughter Sofia was holding his hand, and his son Carlos was trying to be brave. The janitor? Miguel's voice was hoarse from smoke inhalation. "He's alive," Maria said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved him. You saved them all." The news reported that all 327 students and staff had survived the Riverside Elementary fire, thanks to the heroic efforts of the fire department. But Miguel knew the truth: he had saved no one by his own strength alone. At the ceremony where he received the department's highest honor, Miguel was asked to speak. He looked out at the crowd of firefighters, city officials, and survivors' families. "People ask me how we do this job," he said, his voice steady but humble. "How we run into burning buildings when everyone else is running out. We don't do it alone. We carry something with us as faith, hope, the prayers of those who love us. In our darkest moments, when the smoke is thick and the heat is overwhelming, we remember that we're part of something bigger than ourselves." He paused, looking at Mr. Davis in the audience, alive and healthy. "Prayer isn't just asking for help," Miguel continued. "It's remembering that even amid chaos and destruction, there's still light. There's still hope. There's still love. And sometimes, that's enough to carry us through the fire." After the ceremony, a young firefighter approached Miguel. "Captain, I've been struggling with my faith lately. After some things I've seen." Miguel placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Faith isn't about having all the answers," he said. "It's about having the courage to keep asking the questions, even when the world seems to burn down around you. That's when we need it most." That night, Miguel knelt beside his bed for the first time in years and prayed, not just for protection or guidance, but in gratitude for the privilege of serving others, and for the peace that comes from knowing that even in the darkest moments, we are never truly alone. 4. The silent artist David Chen was 8 years old when meningitis stole his hearing, but it would take 37 years for him to understand that it had also given him a gift. Growing up deaf in a hearing world had been a daily exercise in isolation. School was a struggle of missed instructions and sideways glances. Social gatherings became minefields of confusion where David would smile and nod, pretending to understand conversations he could not hear. His parents, loving but overwhelmed, focused on speech therapy and lip-reading lessons, always trying to help him fit into a world that seemed determined to exclude him. By the time David reached adulthood, he had mastered the art of camouflage. He worked as a data analyst, a job where he could excel in solitude, communicating primarily through email and written reports. His coworkers respected his work but knew little about him as a person. David told himself this was enough, that a quiet, predictable life was all he could reasonably expect. But late at night, in the silence that was both his prison and his sanctuary, David found himself drawn to something he had discovered in high school art class: painting. His first attempts were tentative, almost apologetic. Still life paintings of fruit bowls and coffee cups, safe, unremarkable subjects that demanded nothing of the viewer. But gradually, as his confidence grew, something extraordinary emerged from David's canvases. Because David experienced the world without sound, he had learned to see it with extraordinary intensity. He noticed the way morning light caught dust motes dancing in the air, how emotions played across people's faces in micro-expressions that others missed, how colors seemed to vibrate with their own internal music. His paintings captured these overlooked details with stunning precision. The breakthrough came during his 42nd year. David was sitting in a coffee shop, sketching the afternoon crowd, when he noticed a young mother singing to her deaf toddler. The child's face lit up with pure joy as he signed back, his tiny hands moving with animated excitement. David was transfixed. That night, he painted what he had seen, not just the mother and child, but the conversation itself. Using bold strokes and flowing colors, he painted the signs as visual music, each gesture leaving trails of light and emotion across the canvas. The painting pulsed with life, with communication, with a love that transcended the need for sound. David titled it "The Language of Light." His landlord, Mrs. Patterson, saw the painting when she came to fix a leaky faucet. She stood before it for 10 minutes, tears streaming down her face. "My grandson is deaf," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. This is how I want to see his world. Not as lacking something, but as having something beautiful that others don't." At Mrs. Patterson's urging, David entered the language of light in a local art exhibition. He withdrew almost 3 times, paralyzed by the fear of exposing his inner world to judgment. But something about the painting felt too important to hide. The opening night was torture. David stood in the corner, watching people's reactions to his work. Some walked past quickly, others paused with puzzled expressions. But then he noticed a small crowd gathering around his painting. A woman was crying. A man was signing to his daughter, pointing at the painted gestures. The old man's finger followed the colorful design, his mouth opens in amazement. The gallery owner, Sarah Martinez, approached David with excitement. "I've seen nothing like this," she said, her signs fluid and expressive. David was stunned to realize she was deaf, too. "You've painted sound for those who can't hear it, and silence for those who can't find it. It's revolutionary." That night marked the beginning of David's transformation from invisible data analyst to celebrated artist. But more importantly, it marked his journey from seeing his deafness as a disability to understanding it as a unique lens through which he could show others the world's hidden beauty. His next series, Conversations in Color, depicted the signing deaf community with unprecedented intimacy and grace. Each painting captured not just the visual beauty of sign language, but the emotional depth and cultural richness of deaf communication. David painted the poetry of hands, the music of movement, the symphony of expression that existed in a world beyond sound. The series featured in galleries across the country. Art critics called his work transformative and visually symphonic. But the response that mattered most to David came from the deaf community itself. Young deaf children saw his paintings and suddenly felt proud of their language. Hearing parents of deaf children found hope and beauty in their children's futures. David began teaching art workshops for deaf students, showing them how to channel their unique perspective into creative expression. He developed a technique he called visual music, where students painted the rhythm and melody they felt rather than heard. One student, a teenager named Marcus who had recently lost his hearing in an accident, was struggling with depression and anger. During his first workshop, he threw his paintbrush across the room. "I used to be a musician," Marcus sighed angrily. "Now I'm nothing." David painted alongside him for weeks, never pushing, never lecturing, just creating. Gradually, Marcus saw how the visual world could hold its own music. His paintings evolved from dark, angry slashes to flowing compositions that captured the rhythm he still felt in his body, the melodies that lived in his memory. At Marcus's first exhibition, his grandmother wept as she stood before his painting titled "The Song I Still Hear." In swirling blues and golds, Marcus had painted the lullaby she used to sing to him, transformed into visual poetry that was more beautiful than the original. David's greatest achievement came when the Metropolitan Museum of Art gained 3 of his paintings for their permanent collection. At the dedication ceremony, surrounded by art critics, museum patrons, and members of both the hearing and deaf communities, David was asked to speak about his work. Standing before the microphone, with an interpreter beside him, David signed his response with the confidence of a man who had found his voice. "Art is not about what you can or cannot hear, see, or feel," he signed, his hands moving with the same grace that flowed through his paintings. "Art is about translating human experience into something that touches the soul. My deafness didn't take away my ability to communicate, it taught me a different language, one that addresses the heart." He paused, looking at his painting hanging on the museum wall, then back at the audience. "We all have unique ways of experiencing the world. The question is, will we hide our differences, or will we celebrate them as gifts that allow us to show others what they might otherwise miss?" As the audience erupted in applause and animated signing, David thought about that 8-year-old boy who had been so afraid of being different. If he could go back and tell that child one thing, it would be this: your silence is not empty, it's full of possibilities waiting to be painted into existence. Today, David's studio is filled with the colorful chaos of creation. Students come to learn not just painting techniques, but how to transform their unique perspectives into art that speaks to universal truths. On his easel sits his latest work in progress, a painting of hands reaching toward light, titled "What We Cannot Hear, We Can Still Feel." It has its tribute to everyone who has ever felt different, misunderstood, or overlooked. Through his art, David continues to prove that the most profound communication often happens in the spaces between words, in the heart's language that requires no sound at all. 5. The widow's garden. Margaret Sullivan had not set foot in her backyard for 8 months. Not since the morning she found her husband Thomas collapsed among his beloved tomato plants, his hands still clutching the watering can that had been his companion for 43 years of marriage. The garden had been Thomas's domain, his sanctuary, his pride. Every morning at sunrise, He would appear with his coffee and spend hours tending to vegetables, flowers, and herbs with the devotion of a man nurturing his children. Margaret had always been content to admire his work from the kitchen window, marveling at how his gentle hands could coax life from the stubborn earth. Now, 8 months after his funeral, the garden looked like a monument to neglect. Weeds choked the flower beds where prize-winning roses once bloomed. The greenhouse Thomas had built himself stood empty, its windows clouded with dust and regret. The fruit trees he had grafted with such patience drooped with unpicked, rotting fruit. Margaret's children had offered to hire a landscaping service to clean up the mess, but she could not bear the thought of strangers erasing the last traces of Thomas's presence. Yet neither could she face the overwhelming task of restoration alone. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Margaret was sitting at her kitchen table, mechanically eating toast and scrolling through condolence cards she had read 100 times, when she noticed something outside the window. A single daffodil had pushed through the tangle of weeds in what used to be Thomas's bulb garden. Its yellow face turned toward the morning sun with stubborn optimism. Thomas had planted those bulbs the autumn before his death, kneeling in the dirt despite his arthritis, telling Margaret with excitement about the surprise he was planning for her. "Wait until you see what I've got coming up in spring," he had said, his eyes twinkling with the secret only gardeners know, that hope can be buried in the ground and will still find its way to light. Margaret put on Thomas's old work boots, which were still caked with dried mud from their last morning together. They were too large for her feet, but somehow they felt like a protective blessing as she strolled toward the garden. The scene was even more heartbreaking up close. Thomas's carefully labeled plant stakes lay scattered and broken. The compost bin he had tended like a science experiment was overflowing with decomposed leaves. But everywhere Margaret looked, she saw signs of life struggling to appear despite the neglect. She knelt beside the lonely daffodil and began pulling weeds with her bare hands. The earth was cold and damp, and her back ached within minutes, but something about the simple act of clearing a space around the flower felt like prayer. Each weed she removed revealed more evidence of Thomas's final season of planting: crocus shoots, tulip spears, the tender green tips of his favorite irises. That afternoon, Margaret called her daughter Sarah. "I need to learn how to garden," she said without preamble. Sarah, who had been worried about her mother's withdrawal from life, nearly dropped the phone. "Mom, you've shown no interest in gardening before." "That was when I had your father to do it for me," Margaret replied. "Now I need to learn to do it for him." Margaret threw herself into gardening with the intensity of a woman on a mission. She bought books, watched YouTube videos, and joined online forums where strangers patiently answered her endless questions about soil pH and pruning schedules. She discovered Thomas had left meticulous journals documenting every aspect of his garden: planting dates, fertilizer schedules, weather observations, and most touchingly, his hopes and dreams for each season. Planted Margaret's favorite lavender by the kitchen window, read one entry from 5 years earlier. "Hope she notices the smell when she does dishes." She had never noticed. As spring progressed, Margaret woke before dawn, eager to check on her emerging plants. She learned to find seedlings, to distinguish between flowers and weeds in their earliest stages, to read the subtle signs that showed when plants needed water or nutrients. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of indoor work, became calloused and stained with earth. The physical labor was harder than she had expected. At 68, her knees protested kneeling, her shoulders ached from digging, and her back reminded her daily that she was trying something her body was not conditioned for. But with each day of work, Margaret felt herself growing stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. She understood why Thomas had risen so early each morning, why he had spoken to his plants as if they were old friends, why he had grieved over every failure and celebrated every success. Gardening was not just about growing things, it was about nurturing hope, about investing in a future you might not see, about finding joy in the simple miracle of growth. The real transformation came in late spring when Margaret's first successfully grown tomatoes ripened. She picked one, a perfect red orb that warmed her palm, and bit into it right there in the garden. The taste exploded in her mouth, sweet and acidic and somehow infused with sunshine and love and the ghost of Thomas's hands that had planted its ancestors. She stood there crying and laughing simultaneously, juice running down her chin, overwhelmed by gratitude so intensely it felt like a physical force. Not just gratitude for the tomato, but for the soil that supported it, the rain that fed it, the sun that warmed it, and the husband who had loved her enough to teach her this lesson without even knowing he was doing it. That evening, Margaret called her scattered children and invited them for dinner. "I want to cook for you using vegetables from the garden," she said. "From our garden." The dinner was a revelation. Margaret's son David, who had been worried about his mother's isolation, watched in amazement as she excitedly explained the provenance of every dish, the basil she had grown from seed, the squash that had sprawled beyond its designated bed, the herbs she was already drying for winter use. "Mom," her daughter Sarah said, tears in her eyes, "you seem happy." Thrilled, for the first time since Dad died. Margaret looked around the table at her children's faces, then out the window at the garden that had become her salvation. "Your father left me the most amazing gift," she said. "He taught me that growing things isn't about controlling life, it's about participating in it. Every day, I go out there and work alongside forces so much bigger than myself. I plant seeds not knowing if they'll grow, tend plants not knowing if they'll survive, and somehow that uncertainty has become the most comforting thing in my life." As autumn approached, Margaret began planning for the following year. She ordered bulbs to add to Thomas's original planting, selected seeds for new varieties she wanted to try, and sketched designs for expanding the flower beds. She had discovered that gardening was not a destination but a journey, not a problem to solve, but a relationship to cultivate. The first anniversary of Thomas's death arrived on a crisp October morning. Margaret rose before dawn and walked to the garden carrying a cup of coffee and a folding chair. She sat among the late-season blooms and spoke to her husband as the sun painted the sky in watercolors of pink and gold. "I finally understand," she told him. "This garden isn't just about the plants. It's about faith. Faith that winter will end, that spring will come, that what appears dead will bloom again. Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't end when someone dies, it just takes a different form." As if in response to her words, a butterfly landed on the late-blooming asters Thomas had planted as a farewell gift to the pollinators who had helped his garden thrive. Margaret watched its feeding, its wings catching the morning light, and felt her heart fill with a peace she had not known was possible. She had learned that healing, like gardening, happens in seasons. There are times for planting, times for tending, times for harvesting, and times for rest. The key is trusting the process, showing up consistently, and believing that what looks like death is often just dormancy, a gathering of strength for the next beautiful beginning. Today, Margaret's Garden is a place of pilgrimage for neighbors and friends who come not just to admire the flowers, but to learn about resilience from a woman who discovered that the most profound growth often happens in the soil of loss. She has become a primary gardener in every sense of the word, cultivating not just plants but hope, not just flowers but joy, not just vegetables, but the deep understanding that life is always, always worth nurturing. 6. The Street Child's Ascent. At 10 years old, Antonio Vasquez knew the difference between the sound of footsteps that meant safety and those that meant he needed to run. He could name unmarked police cars 3 blocks away, knew which dumpsters behind which restaurants might yield edible food, and understood that survival on the streets required wisdom that no classroom could teach. Antonio's journey to the streets had begun 2 years earlier when his mother succumbed to addiction and his father disappeared into the night. Foster care had been a revolving door of temporary placements and broken promises until Antonio finally decided that the unpredictable dangers of street life were preferable to the predictable pain of abandonment. He lived in the shadows of downtown Los Angeles, in an encampment beneath the overpass where a dozen other homeless individuals had created a makeshift community. There was Rosa, an elderly woman who had lost her apartment when her fixed income could not keep pace with rent increases. Miguel, a veteran whose PTSD had cost him his job and his family. And several other children, like Antonio, casualties of a system that had failed them before they were old enough to understand what failure meant. But Antonio's life changed on a rainy Tuesday when he tried to steal a sandwich from a small law office near the courthouse. He had been watching the building for days, noting the patterns of the employees, the times when the small kitchen was left unattended. Hunger had become a constant companion, a gnawing presence that made concentration difficult and sleep elusive. The sandwich sitting unwrapped on the counter seemed like a gift from God. Antonio was reaching for it when a voice behind him said, "If you're hungry, there's more food in the refrigerator." He spun around, ready to run, but faced a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair. She wore a simple business suit and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "I'm Maria Santos," she said, extending her hand as if Antonio were a business associate rather than a street child stealing. "I'm an attorney." "And you are?" Antonio had learned not to trust adults, especially those who seemed too nice. But something in Maria's manner, the way she looked directly at him without pity or judgment, made him pause. "Antonio," he whispered. "Well, Antonio, why don't you have that sandwich and tell me why you're not in school today?" What followed was the most honest conversation Antonio had had with an adult in years. Maria listened without interrupting as he explained his situation, nodding occasionally but never making the promises that adults always made and never kept. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Antonio," she finally said, "I want to make you an offer. I come to this office every weekday at 7 in the morning. If you're here when I arrive, I'll give you breakfast, and we'll spend an hour on your education before I start work. In exchange, you help me with filing, organizing, and doing basic office tasks. No questions asked about where you sleep or what you do the rest of the time. Deal? Antonio almost rejected. He had learned that accepting help from adults usually came with conditions he could not meet and expectations he could not fulfill. But something about Maria's straightforward proposition felt different. She was not trying to save him or fix him, she was offering him a trade. The next morning, Antonio was waiting by the office door when Maria arrived. Their arrangement began simply. Maria would bring breakfast, real food, not the scraps Antonio was used to, and they would spend an hour working on basic skills. Reading, writing, arithmetic, subjects that Antonio had missed during his chaotic years in and out of school. Maria discovered that beneath the street-hardened exterior was a brilliant mind starving for knowledge. Antonio absorbed information like a sponge, asking questions that revealed a hunger for understanding that went far beyond mere survival. He was drawn to stories about justice and fairness, concepts that had been absent from his lived experience. Why do some people get to make the rules while others have to follow them? He asked one morning while reading about the Constitution. That's the most important question in law, Maria replied. The whole point of our legal system is supposed to be that everyone gets equal treatment under the rules, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Antonio looked skeptical. But that's not really true, is it? Rich people get different treatment than poor people. Maria paused in her review files. You're absolutely right. The system isn't perfect. But that's exactly why we need people who understand both sides, people who have experienced injustice personally and want to fix it. As months passed, their morning sessions expanded. Maria began teaching Antonio about the law itself, not just academic concepts, but practical applications. She explained how legal aid worked, how public defenders ran, and how the court system was supposed to protect people who could not protect themselves. Antonio proved to have an intuitive understanding of legal reasoning. He could name inconsistencies in arguments, spot unfair patterns in how laws were applied, and articulate solutions with a clarity that surprised even Maria. But Antonio's real education was not just academic. Through his work in Maria's office, he met clients from his own community facing eviction, dealing with immigration issues, fighting for disability benefits, or trying to navigate the family court. He saw how legal knowledge, a powerful tool could be helping people who had been forgotten by society. One case affected him. Rosa, older adult woman from his homeless encampment, had been cited for illegal camping and faced fines she could not pay. Antonio convinced her to let Maria be her pro bono, and together they built a case highlighting the city's failure to offer adequate shelter alternatives. You helped me see this case from a different angle, Maria told Antonio after they won the dismissal of the charges. Your understanding of the street community gave me insights I never would have had otherwise. Antonio realized that his experiences, the very experiences that had made him feel worthless and abandoned, gave him unique qualifications to help others in similar situations. As Antonio approached his 16th birthday, Maria broached a subject they had both been thinking about but neither had dared to discuss. Have you ever thought about getting your GED? She asked one morning. Antonio had thought about it constantly, but the practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. How can I study for it when I don't have a stable place to live? How can I take the test without an address? How can I even dream about college when I don't have money for application fees? Maria smiled. Antonio, I've been practicing law for 25 years, and I've learned that every problem has a solution if you're creative enough to find it. Are you willing to let me help you figure this out? What followed was the most intense year of Antonio's life. Maria connected him with social services to prove temporary guardianship, arranged for him to receive tutoring through a non-profit organization, and helped him navigate the bureaucracy of enrollment in a GED program. The studying was grueling. Antonio had years of educational gaps to fill, concepts to master that most students learned gradually over many years. But his street-honed discipline and his burning desire to prove himself worthy of Maria's faith drove him forward. He passed the GED exam with scores high enough to qualify for college scholarships. Maria helped him apply to universities with strong pre-law programs and need-based financial aid. The day Antonio received his acceptance letter to UCLA, he sat in Maria's office and cried, not from sadness, but from joy so overwhelming it felt like drowning in light. "I don't know how to thank you," he said through his tears. "Don't thank me yet," Maria replied, with a grin. "Wait until you see how much reading I'm assigning you this summer to prepare for your first semester." Antonio's college years were a blur of studying, working part-time jobs, and keeping his connection to the homeless community that had raised him. He volunteered at legal aid clinics, translating between the formal language of law and the street wisdom of his former neighbors. Law school brought new challenges. Many of his classmates came from privileged backgrounds and could not understand his perspective on issues of poverty and homelessness. Some professors initially underestimated his abilities based on his background. But Antonio had learned something on the streets that his privileged classmates had not: persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. He graduated in the top 10% of his class and was recruited by several prestigious law firms. Instead, he joined the public defender's office. "I could make more money at a corporate firm," he explained to Maria, who had become not just his mentor but his adopted family. "But money isn't why I studied law. I studied law to be the advocate I needed when I was 10 years old and had nowhere to turn." Today, Antonio Vasquez is a senior attorney with the Los Angeles Public Defender's Office, specializing in standing for homeless individuals and children in the foster care system. His office walls are covered with thank you letters from clients whose lives he has helped transform. But the letter that means the most to him is a brief note from Maria: "I always knew you would change the world. I just didn't know you would change mine, too." Antonio's work extends beyond individual cases. He has testified before the City Council about the need for comprehensive homeless services, authored policy papers on juvenile justice reform, and founded a non-profit organization that educates at-risk youth. But perhaps his greatest achievement is the mentorship program he set up, pairing homeless children with legal professionals who provide the same combination of practical support and educational opportunity that Maria once gave him. At the program's 10th anniversary celebration, Antonio addressed a room full of young people who reminded him of his younger self, hungry, scared, but burning with potential. "Everyone in this room has something that privileged kids don't have," he told them. You have the experience of surviving when the odds were stacked against you. You understand injustice in a way that textbooks can't teach. The question isn't whether you're smart enough or strong enough to change your circumstances. You've already proven that by being here today. The question is, what are you going to do with that strength once you develop the tools to use it? After the event, a shy 12-year-old girl approached him. She reminded him painfully of himself at that age, thin, wary, but with eyes that held a flicker of hope. "Mr. Vasquez," she whispered, "do you really think someone like me could become a lawyer?" Antonio knelt to her level, remembering another lawyer who had once looked him in the eye and treated him with dignity when the rest of the world saw only a problem to be solved. "I don't think you could become a lawyer," he said with a smile. "I know you could. The only question is, are you ready to do the work?" As he watched the girl's face light up with possibility, Antonio thought about the journey that had brought him from stealing sandwiches to advocating for justice. It had not been easy, and it had not been fast, but it had been worth every struggle. He had learned that education is not just about getting knowledge, it has about transformed pain into purpose, experience into wisdom, and survival into service. Most importantly, he had learned that no child is disposable, no dream is too big, and no background is too humble to produce someone who can change the world. The street child had not just ascended, he had become a ladder for others to climb. 7. The nurses promised Sarah Mitchell had been a pediatric nurse for 15 years when the pandemic arrived, but nothing in her career had prepared her for the morning she stood outside room 237, afraid to enter. Inside lay 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, alone and fighting for her life on a ventilator. Emma's parents were quarantined in another part of the hospital, both critically ill with COVID-19. Her grandparents were in a different state, desperate to help but unable to travel. Emma was facing the most frightening experience of her young life, with no familiar faces, no comforting voices, no one to hold her hand. Sarah had volunteered to be Emma's primary nurse, but as she stood in the hallway doing her protective equipment for the 6th time after that shift, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like lead. How do you become a mother, father, grandparent, and friend to a child who might not survive? How do you carry hope for someone else when your own reserves are running dangerously low? The pandemic had transformed Sarah's world into something unrecognizable. The pediatric ward where she had once been surrounded by the cheerful chaos of healing children had become eerily quiet, punctuated only by the mechanical breathing of ventilators and the soft beeping of monitors. Visiting restrictions meant ill children faced their battles alone, and healthcare workers had become surrogate families for patients who desperately needed more than medical care. Sarah's own family had been asking her to take a leave of absence. Her husband Mark worried about her exposure risk. Her teenage daughter Jessica had been staying with her grandparents for weeks to avoid potential infection. Her elderly mother called daily, begging Sarah to just come home until this is over. But Sarah could not leave. Not when children like Emma needed her. She entered room 237 with forced cheerfulness, whispering to Emma even though the child appeared unconscious. Sarah had learned that hearing was often the last sense to fade, and she refused to let Emma feel alone in the darkness. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sarah said, adjusting Emma's blankets with gentle hands. "I'm Sarah, and I'm going to take care of you today. I know you can't see me right now, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Sarah began what would become her daily ritual with Emma. She narrated everything she was doing, checking vitals, adjusting medication, checking the ventilator, in the same gentle voice she used with her own daughter. She brought a small speaker and played soft music, rotating between children's songs and classical pieces that seemed to calm Emma's restless movements. But most importantly, Sarah talked to Emma as if she were awake and listening. "I bet you're wondering where your mama and papa are," Sarah said while recording Emma's temperature. "They're here in the hospital too, getting better just like you are. They love you so much, Emma. They made me promise to tell you that every single day." What Sarah did not tell Emma was that her parents' condition was worsening, that her father had been placed on a ventilator the night before, and that her mother was fighting a secondary infection that the medical team had been deeply concerned about. As days passed, Sarah spent more time in Emma's room than her schedule technically needed. During her breaks, she would sit beside Emma's bed and read children's books aloud. She brought photos that Emma's grandparents had sent via email, describing each family member and sharing stories about Emma's life before the hospital. "Your abuela sent me a picture of the birthday party she threw for you last year," Sarah said one afternoon, holding up her phone. "She said you insisted on a princess cake, but you wanted to wear your soccer uniform to the party. She thinks you're the most beautiful princess in the world, uniform and all." Sarah's colleagues worried about her emotional investment in Emma's case. The nurse in charge, Patricia, pulled her aside after a particularly long shift. "Sarah, I know you care about that little girl, but you need to maintain some professional distance. This pandemic is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. You can't pour everything you have into one patient." But Sarah could not explain what Patricia did not understand, that Emma had become more than a patient. In a time when the world felt like it was falling apart, when death seemed to lurk around every corner, caring for Emma had given Sarah a reason to believe that love could still triumph over fear. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning during Sarah's third week as Emma's primary nurse. As Sarah was adjusting the child's position to prevent bed sores, Emma's eyes fluttered open for the first time since her admission. "Emma." Sarah's voice was thick with emotion. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" Emma's eyes found Sarah's face behind the protective mask, and though she could not speak because of the ventilator, Sarah saw recognition and relief flood the child's expression. "I'm Sarah," she said, taking Emma's small hand in her gloved one. "I have been taking care of you, and I am so happy to finally see your beautiful eyes." Over the following days, Emma's condition gradually improved. The ventilator was removed, replaced by a nasal cannula that allowed her to speak in whispered words. Her first question, asked in a voice hoarse from weeks of intubation, nearly broke Sarah's heart. Where is my mama?" Sarah had been dreading this moment. Emma's father had died 2 days earlier, and her mother remained in critical condition. But Emma was still too fragile for the full truth. "Your mama is still getting medicine to help her feel better," Sarah said carefully. "But she asked me to tell you something very important. She said to tell you she loves you more than all the stars in the sky, and that you are the bravest, strongest girl she has ever known." As Emma's physical recovery progressed, Sarah faced the heartbreaking task of helping the child process the loss of her father and the uncertainties surrounding her mother's condition. Child psychologists were available via video call, but Emma seemed to trust only Sarah with her fears and questions. "Am I going to be an orphan?" Emma asked one afternoon. Her 8-year-old vocabulary was unable to fully express the terror behind the question. Sarah's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "Emma, no matter what happens, you will always be loved. Your abuela and abuelo are working extremely hard to come to get you as soon as it's safe. And until then, I'm going to make sure you're never alone." It was a promise Sarah had no authority to make, but she made it. Emma's mother passed away on a Tuesday evening while Sarah was at home with her own family for the first time in weeks. The call came at midnight, and Sarah rushed back to the hospital to be with Emma when she woke up. Telling a child that both parents have died is a task for which no training can truly prepare you. Sarah sat on Emma's bed, holding the little girl as she sobbed with grief, too large for her small body to have. "I want my mama," Emma cried repeatedly. "I want to go home." "I know, baby," Sarah whispered, her own tears soaking into Emma's hair. "I know you do. And someday, when you're all better, you're going to go live with your abuela and abuelo who love you so much. But right now, you're going to stay here with me, and we're going to take care of each other, okay?" The weeks that followed were among the most challenging of Sarah's career. Emma's grief manifested in nightmares, crying spells, and regression in her physical recovery. But slowly, with patience and consistent love, Sarah helped Emma heal. Sarah's own family had reached their breaking point. Her husband issued an ultimatum: either she took leave at once, or he would take their daughter and stay with his parents indefinitely. Sarah faced an impossible choice between her professional calling and her personal responsibilities. The solution came from an unexpected source. Emma's grandparents, who had been working desperately to arrange safe travel from Mexico, finally received clearance to enter the United States. But they would need to quarantine for 2 weeks before they could take custody of Emma. "Would you consider extending your stay here for 2 more weeks?" Sarah asked Emma gently. "Your grandparents are coming, but they need to make sure they're healthy first, so they don't accidentally make you sick." Emma nodded solemnly, then looked up at Sarah with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "Will you stay with me until they come?" "Every day," Sarah promised. Those final 2 weeks became a celebration of resilience and healing. Emma's physical recovery sped up, and she showed glimpses of the spirited child she had been before tragedy struck. She drew pictures for her grandparents, practiced the Spanish words she would need to communicate with them, and even smiled occasionally at Sarah's terrible jokes. On the day Emma's grandparents arrived, Sarah stood in the hallway and watched through the window as 3 generations of a fractured family found each other again. Emma's grandmother wept as she held her granddaughter for the first time in 2 years. Her grandfather, a stoic man who had driven 26 hours straight to reach the hospital, failed completely when Emma whispered abuelo and reached for his hand. Before they left, Emma's grandmother approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "Senora Sarah," she said in careful English, "my Emma, she tells me you were her angel when she had no one. How can I thank you for giving me back my granddaughter?" Sarah knelt at Emma's level one last time. You remember what I told you, okay? You are braver and stronger than you know. And whenever you feel scared or sad, you remember that your mama and papa's love is always with you, and so is mine." Emma threw her arms around Sarah's neck with the fierce intensity of a child who understands the gravity of goodbye. "I love you, Nurse Sarah," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping your promise." As Sarah watched Emma walk away with her grandparents, she realized that the little girl had given her something precious in return. In a time when the world felt dark and uncertain, Emma had reminded Sarah why she became a nurse in the first place, not just to provide medical care, but to be a beacon of hope and love when people needed it most. Sarah returned to work the next day to find a new patient assignment, a 6-year-old boy whose parents were both in the ICU. As she stood outside his room, doing her protective equipment and steady her nerves, Sarah thought about the promise she had made to Emma and realized it was a promise she would make again. Because sometimes, being a nurse means being more than a healthcare provider. Sometimes it means being the person who holds hope when others cannot, who provides love when families are separated, who promises to stay when everyone else must leave. Sarah entered the room and introduced herself to another frightened child, ready to prove once again that healing is about more than medicine. It has about the unbreakable bonds we form in our darkest moments, and the light we choose to shine for each other when the world feels impossibly dark. 8. The lost and found Robertson had not spoken to his son in 12 years when the phone call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The voice on the other end was young, professional, and carefully neutral, the voice trained to deliver devastating news without revealing how often it had to do so. "Mr. Chen? This is Dr. Martinez from St. Mary's Hospital. Your son Daniel has listed you as his emergency contact. He's been in a serious accident." Robert's hands shook as he wrote the hospital address, his mind struggling to process the information. Daniel had listed him as an emergency contact. After 12 years of silence, 12 years of returned letters and unanswered calls, his son still considered him the person to notify in a crisis. The drive to the hospital gave Robert too much time to think about the last conversation they had shared. Daniel had been 22 then, fresh out of college and burning with righteous anger about his father's decision to remarry just 2 years after his mother's death from cancer. "You couldn't even wait until her grave was cold," Daniel had screamed, his face twisted with a pain that went deeper than mere anger. "Mom fought for 3 years, and you replace her in 3 months?" Robert had tried to explain that Linda was not a replacement, that his mother would have wanted him to find happiness again, that grief had taught him how precious and fragile love could be. But Daniel would not listen. He moved across the country that same month, built a new life in Seattle, and erected walls that Robert's attempts at reconciliation could not penetrate. Now, standing in the fluorescent-lit corridor of the ICU, Robert faced the son he had not seen since that terrible fight. Daniel was 34 now. His boy's face matured into sharp cheekbones and laugh lines that spoke of a life Robert knew nothing about. But lying unconscious with a ventilator breathing for him, Daniel looked achingly young and vulnerable. Dr. Martinez explained the accident. A drunk driver had run a red light. Daniel's car had been T-boned at 60 miles per hour. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, traumatic brain injury. The next 72 hours would be critical. "Does he have any other family we should contact?" the doctor asked. A spouse, children? Robert realized with a crushing sense of loss that he did not know. His son might be married, might have children, might have built an entire family that Robert had never met. 12 years of stubbornness had cost him not just his relationship with Daniel, but potential relationships with grandchildren he might never know. Over the following days, as Daniel fought for his life in the ICU, Robert pieced together the mystery of his son's adult life. The contents of Daniel's wallet told part of the story, business cards finding him as a social worker specializing in family reunification, a photo of him with a group of children at what looked like a summer camp, membership cards for various volunteer organizations. Daniel's apartment, which Robert felt intrusive entering but needed to search for insurance information, revealed more. The walls were covered with thank you cards from families Daniel had helped reunite, photos of children he had mentored, certificates recognizing his work with at-risk youth. A journal on his nightstand had entries about his passion for helping families heal from trauma and separation. The cruel irony was not lost on Robert. His son had devoted his career to bringing families together while refusing to reconcile with his own father. On the fourth day, Daniel's eyes opened. The first word he spoke, when the ventilator was removed, was "Dad." Not a greeting, but a question filled with confusion and something that might have been hope. "I'm here," Robert said, taking his son's hand for the first time in over a decade. "I've been here since they called." "Why?" Daniel's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with years of damage and misunderstanding. Robert could have given the easy answer, "Because you are my son, because family is family." Instead, he chose truth. "Because I love you," he said simply. "Because I never stopped loving you, even when you couldn't love me back. Because 12 years ago, I was so afraid of being alone with my grief that I made decisions that hurt you, and I've regretted it every day since." Daniel closed his eyes, and Robert thought he had fallen asleep. But then he felt his son's fingers tighten around his hand, just slightly, but unmistakably. Recovery was slow and complicated. Daniel's brain injury affected his short-term memory and emotional regulation, making him sometimes childlike in his responses, sometimes explosive with frustration. Robert learned to navigate these changes with patience he did not know he had, guided by nurses who taught him how to communicate with someone whose brain was relearning how to process the world. During the long days in the rehabilitation hospital, father and son talked for the first time since Daniel was a teenager. Robert learned about his son's work, his passion for helping broken families, and his struggle with depression after their estrangement. Daniel learned about his father's grief after his mother's death, his fear of growing old alone, his regret about how quickly he had sought comfort in a new relationship. "I thought you forgot Mom," Daniel admitted one afternoon during a physical therapy session. "I thought Linda meant you didn't love Mom anymore." Robert stopped pushing the wheelchair and knelt in front of his son. "Danny, I could never forget your mother. Linda didn't replace her, she helped me learn to live with missing her. There's a difference." "I didn't understand that then," Daniel said, tears streaming down his face. "I was so angry, and the anger felt better than the sadness. It was easier to blame you than to deal with losing Mom." "We both made mistakes," Robert replied. "But we're here now. That's what matters." The breakthrough in Daniel's physical recovery came when Robert brought photo albums from Daniel's childhood. As they looked through pictures together, Daniel's damaged brain reconnected with memories that had been temporarily lost. He remembered family vacations, birthday parties, quiet evenings when Robert had helped him with homework while his mother cooked dinner in the kitchen. "We were happy then, weren't we?" Daniel asked, studying a photo of the three of them at his high school graduation. "We were," Robert confirmed. "And we can be happy again." Different, but happy. Daniel's emotional recovery was more complex. The brain injury had left him with reduced impulse control, and suppressed emotions from their 12-year estrangement sometimes erupted without warning. One day he would be an accomplished social worker, articulate and insightful. The next day he would be a grieving 22-year-old, screaming at his father with fresh pain. Robert learned to weather these storms with the same patience he wished he had shown 12 years earlier. He realized that Daniel's brain injury had, in some ways, created an opportunity to address the emotional wounds that had never properly healed. "I understand why you remarried," Daniel said during one of his clearer moments. "I've been helping families for years, and I know that grief affects everyone differently. I was wrong to judge how you processed losing Mom. And I was wrong to rush into marriage without considering how it would affect you," Robert replied. "I should have included you in that decision, helped you understand my feelings instead of expecting you to just accept them." 6 months after the accident, Daniel was ready to leave the rehabilitation facility. His cognitive function had largely returned, though he still struggled with fatigue and occasional memory lapses. More importantly, he had regained something he had lost long before: his relationship with his father. Robert had spent those months not just supporting Daniel's recovery but examining his own life. He realized that his 12-year marriage to Linda, while loving, had been built partly on his fear of being alone. He had never properly grieved his first wife's death, never processed his own trauma, never learned to find peace within himself. "I want to try family therapy," Robert told Daniel as they planned his transition back to independent living. "Not just for us, but for me. I need to understand why I was so afraid of being alone that I will lose my son to avoid it." Daniel, who had returned to his social work training with new insights gained from his own experience of family trauma, smiled at his father's words. "Dad, the families I work with, the ones that heal successfully, they all have one thing in common. They stop trying to go back to how things were before, and they focus on building something new and better." "Is that what we're doing?" Robert asked. "I think so," Daniel replied. "We can't get back the 12 years we lost, but we can make sure we lose no more." Today, Robert and Daniel meet for dinner every Sunday, a tradition they started during Daniel's recovery and have kept for 3 years since the accident. Their relationship differs from what it was before: deeper in some ways, more cautious in others, marked by the intentionality that comes from nearly losing something precious. Daniel has returned to his work in family reunification with new insights about forgiveness and healing. He often shares his own story with the families he serves, not as a model of perfection, but as proof that even the most damaged relationships can be repaired with patience, honesty, and love. Robert has learned to live with himself, not just to avoid solitude, but genuinely to enjoy his own company. He volunteers at the hospital where Daniel recovered, offering support to other families navigating medical crises and relationship challenges. At Daniel's most recent work recognition ceremony, where he received an award for his innovative approaches to family therapy, Robert sat in the audience beaming with pride. When Daniel acknowledged him in his acceptance speech, thanking my father, who taught me it's never too late to come home, Robert understood they had both found what they had been searching for all along. Not a return to innocence, but a journey toward wisdom. Not the erasure of pain, but the transformation of that pain into compassion. Not the family they used to be, but the family they became. The lost had found each other, and in doing so, had found themselves. Story 9. The lighthouse keeper's faith. In a small coastal town where the sea met jagged cliffs, there stood an ancient lighthouse that had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century. Its keeper was an elderly man named Samuel, whose weathered hands had tended the beacon's flame through countless storms and peaceful nights alike. Samuel had inherited this sacred duty from his father, who had received it from his father before him. For 43 years, Samuel had climbed the spiral staircase each evening, lighting the great lamp that would pierce through darkness and fog, offering hope to those lost at sea. His life was simple but profound testament to the power of faithful service. One particularly violent autumn, a storm unlike any Samuel had ever seen, began brewing on the horizon. The wind howled with supernatural fury, and waves crashed against the rocks with such force that the very foundation of the lighthouse trembled. As night fell, the electricity failed throughout the town, plunging everything into complete darkness except for Samuel's beacon. During the height of the tempest, Samuel noticed something that made his heart race, a ship's distress signal flickering desperately in the distance. The vessel was being pushed dangerously close to the hidden rocks that had claimed countless lives over the decades. Without the lighthouse's guidance, the ship and all souls aboard would surely perish. But then disaster struck. A massive wave crashed through the lighthouse's lower windows, flooding the generator room and extinguishing the main electrical system. The great beacon went dark for the first time in Samuel's tenure. In that moment of overwhelming darkness, many would have despaired, but Samuel's faith burned brighter than any electric bulb. Remembering his grandfather's stories of the lighthouse's earliest days, Samuel rushed to the storage room where old equipment was kept. There, covered in dust and forgotten, sat the original oil-burning beacon, the same light that had guided ships before electricity ever reached this remote outpost. His hands trembling not from fear but from determination, Samuel filled the reservoir with oil and struck a match. As the ancient flame burst into life, casting its warm, steady glow across the turbulent waters, Samuel felt a profound connection to every lighthouse keeper who had come before him. This was not just about keeping light, it was about being a guardian of hope, a sentinel against despair, a bridge between the lost and the safe harbor. Throughout that terrible night, Samuel tended the flame with unwavering devotion. Every hour, he climbed the stairs to ensure the light remained strong. He prayed for the ship he had seen, for the sailors fighting for their lives, and for the strength to continue his vigil until dawn. The oil flame, though smaller than the electric beacon, seemed to burn with supernatural intensity, cutting through the storm with remarkable clarity. When morning finally broke, revealing calm seas and clear skies, Samuel discovered something miraculous. Not only had the ship he had seen made it safely to the harbor, but the captain reported that during the darkest hour of the storm, when all seemed lost, they had seen a light more brilliant and comforting than any they had ever witnessed. The captain spoke of how that light had filled his crew with inexplicable peace and guided them through the treacherous waters to safety. Word of Samuel's heroic night spread throughout the coastal communities. Many offered to upgrade the lighthouse with modern backup systems and redundant power sources. But Samuel, now understanding something profound about his calling, insisted that the old oil beacon remain permanently installed alongside the electric system. Some lights, he explained, burn brightest when everything else fails. Faith isn't just believing when it's easy, it's keeping the flame alive when the storms rage and the power goes out. Years later, when Samuel finally passed the lighthouse keeper's duty to his own son, he shared the most important lesson he had learned. Anyone can tend to light when the switch works and the power flows. But a true keeper of the light understands that the most important moments are when everything fails except your faith. In those moments, you discover that the light you've been tending all along wasn't just in the beacon, it was in your heart. Samuel's lighthouse still stands today, its dual system serving as a reminder that while modern conveniences may fail, faith and dedication create a light that can weather any storm. Every evening at sunset, when the beacon is lit, residents of the town remember that sometimes the most powerful light comes not from the strongest bulb, but from the most faithful heart. Story 10. The teacher's last lesson. Margaret Thompson had taught third grade for 37 years in the same small-town elementary school. Her classroom was a sanctuary of learning where curiosity flourished, and young minds discovered the joy of knowledge. But this school year would evaluate everything she believed about the power of education and the resilience of the human spirit. The year began with disturbing news. The school district was facing severe budget cuts, and Margaret's position was being eliminated. At 62, she was too young for a comfortable retirement, yet too old to easily find new employment. The principal, tears in his eyes, delivered the news personally, explaining that her decades of service and countless contributions to the community could not protect her from the harsh reality of financial constraints. Margaret could have spent her final year going through the motions, bitter about the injustice and focused on her uncertain future. Instead, she made a decision that would forever change the lives of her 23 students and leave a legacy that extended far beyond the classroom walls. "If this is to be my last year of teaching," she told her husband that evening, "then I'm going to make it the most meaningful year of my career. These children deserve everything I have to give." Margaret began each day earlier than ever before, arriving at school while the building was still dark and quiet. She used these precious morning hours to personalize learning experiences for each student, finding their unique strengths, challenges, and dreams. She discovered that Tommy, who struggled with reading, had an incredible memory for historical facts. She learned that Maria, who was shy about speaking in class, wrote beautiful poetry in her journal. She noticed that Jake, labeled as hyperactive by earlier teachers, could focus intensely when given first-hand science experiments. Understanding that traditional teaching methods did not reach every child, Margaret transformed her classroom into a living, breathing laboratory of discovery. She created reading nooks for different learning styles, set up science corners where students could conduct safe experiments, and set up art stations where creativity could flourish alongside academic subjects. Every lesson became an adventure, every assignment a quest for knowledge. But Margaret's greatest innovation was something she called dream projects. She assigned each student to research and present something they were enthusiastic about, no matter how unconventional it might seem. One student researched the life cycle of butterflies and created a classroom garden. Another investigated how music affects emotions and composed a song for the class. A third student, fascinated by architecture, designed and built a model of his dream house. As words of Margaret's innovative approach spread, parents began volunteering in unprecedented numbers. Retired community members offered to share their ability. Local businesses donated supplies and resources. The classroom became a hub of intergenerational learning where wisdom flowed in all directions. Midway through the year, something remarkable began happening. Evaluating scores in Margaret's class started climbing dramatically. More importantly, the students' love of learning was becoming infectious throughout the school. Other teachers began adopting some of Margaret's methods. The principal started using her classroom as a model for visiting educators from other districts. But perhaps the most profound transformation was occurring in Margaret herself. Facing the end of her career had stripped away all pretense and fear, leaving her free to teach with pure passion and authenticity. She shared personal stories that illustrated life lessons, connecting academic concepts to real-world applications, and treating each student as a unique individual with unlimited potential. As spring arrived, and Margaret's final months as a teacher approached, the community acted. Parents organized fundraisers, students created petitions signed by hundreds of community members, and local businesses pledged ongoing support. The school board, moved by this unprecedented outpouring of support, found creative ways to restructure the budget and offer Margaret a contract for the following year. When Margaret received the news that her position was saved, she experienced a profound moment of clarity. The threat of losing her career had awakened something within her that had been dormant for years. She realized that her best teaching had appeared not from comfort and security, but from urgency and purpose. On the last day of school, Margaret addressed her students with words that would become a legend in that small town. "This year, I thought I was teaching you your lessons. But you taught me the most important lesson of all. You showed me that when we face our challenges with courage and love, when we refuse to give up on our dreams, and when we pour our whole hearts into whatever time we have left, miracles happen. Not just for us, but for everyone whose lives we touch." Margaret continued teaching for 8 more years before retiring, but she often said that her last year was her first year, the year she finally understood what it meant to teach with everything she had. Her classroom became a pilgrimage site for educators from around the world, and her methods were studied and implemented in schools across the country. The lesson of Margaret Thompson reminds us that sometimes our greatest growth comes not when we are comfortable and secure, but when we are facing uncertainty and loss. In those moments, if we choose courage over fear and purpose over self-pity, we often discover reserves of strength and creativity we never knew we had.